So thank you so much for being with us here, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be here with you this morning. I'm kind of like Gwen, still a little bit speechless after the Right Honorable, so that was an amazing way to start our Saturday. And we have a really interesting panel this morning, looking at the way the panels work here is they complement each other, and I think what you'll find this morning is our panel looking at shifts in global power will do precisely that. We have three interesting perspectives that you're going to hear this morning, and I can't wait to introduce them and to get us going because I know everybody's eager for the Q&A. So I'll start off with Dr. Wenran Jiang. He is the Associate Professor and McTaggart Research Chair of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. And it's a great pleasure to have him here. He just flew in yesterday, so thank you so much for being here with us. Then we have Dr. Andy Knight. He's Professor of International Relations at the University of Alberta and editor of Global Governance Journal. Pleasure having you here. And we have Neil Shenai, who's a PhD candidate at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. So thank you so much, Neil. So I kind of observed that we have two Albertans and an American on our panel, so I think we're going to be off to a great start. But he has a partner from Toronto, Neil, so we'll excuse the American part. But so thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to hear your perspectives. We're going to have 20 minutes for each speaker. I'm going to have a yellow sheet signaling 5-minute window as per your request, so watch out for that. And then we're going to take a 10-minute break after our speakers. We'll get the mics up, and the Right Honorable will join us at the stage, and we will start the Q&A. So off to Dr. Wenran.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you very much for the Couchiching Institute to invite me. This is my first Couchiching conference. Quite an honor to be here. Actually, after Mr. Martin's speech, all of three of us line up, coming up, looking at each other, saying, how do we do this next? So we didn't really say much, but we lined up and went to the washroom. So now we feel a little bit more comfortable. It is indeed a great honor to listen to you, Mr. Martin, with your perspectives and your leadership being recognized through the G20 issues and the global perspectives are indeed inspiring. So without further ado, let me focus on China. That is to complement what Mr. Martin has talked about on the global bigger picture, dimensional issues of crisis, of the systemic changes, watershed or opportunities. I think I would like to focus on where really China fits into all this. And I have my other colleagues who may be able to bring in other international perspectives or US. But the 800-pound gorilla seems to be China nowadays. Everybody wants to understand China and China's rise, whether the rise of China would constitute some kind of systemic challenge, and if it is, to what extent. I was in Beijing. I arrived last night coming from Beijing, but I spent most of the past 3 or 4 months traveling and teaching in China. And I was having a coffee with a major foreign desk editorial editor of a major US newspaper. She was on a group tour to China, and we had a coffee. She said, I just could not understand China. I have so much international experience. I've written editorials for decades. I visited China, I just couldn't figure out how they could do it. She went to Shanghai, she went to Beijing, to a few other cities. I think if the professionals have to struggle, I myself included, if we have to struggle to understand China's rise, I think there's a great need for us to think about these issues. So I would like to phrase my observations, maybe a few points in the next 15 minutes, in terms of the major debates that we're looking at about China's rise. not only the debate internationally about China's rise, but also how the Chinese actually debate these issues themselves. And I look at the things, I think, in two dimensions. One is that I am a first-generation Canadian, and I grew up in China. I have seen in my lifetime of the starvation of China, of my own generation. At the kindergarten in early 60s, we didn't have enough food to eat. To the time that in early 70s, I was sent to the farm as part of the Cultural Revolution's re-education program to work and assume that I would be building China's new countryside in my lifetime. And then, of course, the systemic dramatic change in the late 70s after Mao's death. I was lucky enough to catch the last group of young people who went to the university. And then in the last 2 decades or so, more as an academic, observing China. So the first issue really, I think people tend to talk about a lot or argue about is really what is the nature of China's rise? Is this one-off challenge to the international system, or as some people put it, to the challenge of the US predominance? People say maybe we had seen the Soviet Russia back in the 1970s. And some people say we had Japan, if you look at the East Asian development model back in the 1980s. But historically, those challenges proven to be temporary and to be one-off. Others, though, think about China's rise in a more fundamental and systemic manner. That is, looking at where China today vis-a-vis the United States, in terms of early 20th century, where the United States was vis-a-vis the Great Britain. And I personally think probably the latter comparison, that is the systemic rise of China, with its dramatic economic strength, with its great power ambitions, with its great GDP strength. Last week, as a matter of fact, the Bank of China or one of the Chinese State Council officials basically announced that at some point last week, China has overtaken Japan as the second largest economy in the world by US dollar measurements. By PPP, purchasing power parity standard, China has been the second largest economy in the world for a long, long time. So we're looking at the China now is gradually re-emerging rather, because if you look at historically, I have some PowerPoints, but I did not put it on. I guess people say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Couchiching has applied that principle to the PowerPoint presentation. So I'm not going to show you all the numbers. You're going to miss some of the very good graphics. But anyway, from 16th century to the early 19th century, actually China had between 25 to 30% of the global GDP. And the United States now is the one who occupied that spot. And India historically followed China, not so much difference. So we're looking now, China now emerging with about 15% of global GDP and edging up. In about 15, 20 years, 25 years, depending on which predictions you're looking at, China will take over from the United States as the largest economy in the world. So this is historical. China is the largest creditor of the United States, owning much of the US debt. So therefore, the rise of China is historical. It's not a one-off situation. Chinese themselves, interestingly, having that kind of proud, being a great power. When you talk to them, and they would like to be counted as a great power. And yet, at the same time, they have this very, very vulnerable internal crisis mentality. They ask that question all the time. Will China's rise or reemergence sustainable? And so here we see the huge perception gap. We're seeing outside world constantly talking about the rising China's menace, powerful, demanding, going all over the place around the world, locking up resources and so on and so forth. The Chinese themselves are constantly talking about whether their reemergence can be sustained, what one day may come in terms of internal or external crisis. So that's, I think, where things are, and we need to look at that China's rise in the more systemic and grand historical perspective. The second issue, or the second debate, is then what is this impact of China's rise or re-emergence in terms of its impact? Okay, so if we accept China's rise is systemic, historical significance, then we're looking at potentially all the large great powers rising in history would cause systemic disequilibrium. And that kind of disequilibrium normally would lead to war. And the wars, in historical sense, that would mean very disturbing to the global system. So now we're talking about G2 or G20. In many ways, I think these systems, these rearrange of power structures is really trying to accommodate the reemergence of China, India, and some other newly emerging economies. So then how do we assess the impact? I think there are two dimensions here. It's difficult if you read popular press that China somehow is a predatory power. China is going to Africa, locking up resources, turning it into a new slave empire. China is doing this and that. And then there's the other side saying China's development is not more positive. I think there are both positive and negatives, both domestically and internationally. On the domestic front, I don't need to say much, but you all know the basic fact that no country in the world history has delivered the economic growth package to this portion of the global population in such a fast speed in the past 30 years. There's no precedent in history. We're talking about in 1981, China's people, the population living in poverty was 84% by World Bank standards, be it $1 per day or $1.25 per day. And by several couple of years ago, mid of 2005, that percentage has dropped to 15%. We're talking about 300 or 400 million people being lifted out of poverty in such a short period of time. And China's economic growth has been very impressive, close to 10% per year in the past 3 decades. Built onto the fact, some people tend to forget, China didn't start in 1979. Actually, China started in 1949, when the modern China we're talking about, when the average life expectancy was 31 years old. And now we're looking at between 72 to 74 years old. It's reaching the middle upper income level. We're talking about astonishing achievements. But at the same time, there are also very serious problems with this development model that Chinese leadership pursued. What I call the past 30 years development of China is really the modernization paradigm on steroids. That's a combination of the Western-style capitalism and the state-led kind of a hybrid of the state power-led economy that pouring large amount of labor, cheap labor, into the economy, large amount of domestic and foreign capital particularly into the infrastructure and manufacturing, export-led growth, large consumption of energy, very much a lot of damage to the environment, and China made it to a certain extent to where China today. But this particular model, everybody now in China, in the debate, acknowledges cannot be sustained. Okay, I give you one example. China now consumes about 8 million barrels a day of oil. United States close to about 20 million barrels. Okay, and China has 4 times of the population of the United States. You do simple mathematics. If every Chinese, 1.3 billion of them, consume on a per capita basis, like the United States, of energy, then China alone would need about 80 million barrels of oil per day. And that's the entire global supply, daily supply of oil. Simply cannot be done if it's being done in a traditional way. Because China wanted to have refrigerators. They want to drive cars. China sold more cars last year than the United States, 13 million plus cars. US, about just over 10 million. China is the largest auto market, largest auto producer. And every major auto producers of the world are producing in China for domestic market, and in the future, I think, for export back to Canada probably, in some ways, challenging our own auto industry, and our auto industry has gone to China. So the issue now here is that traditional paradigm, as it was practiced, if China is going to pursue happiness, consumption the way that North Americans and Europeans have done, cannot be sustained. So the challenge and the debate is how to move on, how to move away to a new paradigm of development. I need to eat some ice myself now. Thank you. So the issue now, other than the domestic dimension, the international dimension, what do we see China now? China, I can give you many numbers. China now, the largest creditor, $2.5 trillion of foreign reserve. That's 1/3 of the global total foreign reserves. And China now turned into the largest trading partner to Africa. China is ascending fast in the Middle East, in Latin America, and everywhere. You can see China's development as a predatory behavior of going everywhere to take over US hegemony or Uncle Sam's property one piece at a time, or you can see this is primarily domestic driven. Remember, the export-led growth of China is not just for Chinese themselves. The global capitalist system has relocated much of its heavy industry and manufacturing into China. More than 60% of China's exports today are procured and produced by foreign multinationals, primarily American ones, in China for the purpose of export. So Walmart has the largest facility in China for good reason, because they make a lot of money. So when we calculate China's energy use and the environmental impact, then we will have a problem now. How do we count all this emission transfers that China is doing? I have an interesting conversation a couple of years ago on a conference with a colleague from India who basically come up saying, hey, don't compare us with China. We're not Chinese. We're not pursuing the Chinese model. We're doing service-oriented industry, high-tech and all that. Well, my question to my friend in India is, are you stopping now consuming less of the energy? Do you not use refrigerators? Are you not driving cars? Are you not using air conditioners? The answer is they use all those facilities and they're on the rise, except that they're just importing them from China. And so the aggregate production is there, and individual countries were in the one package now. So the challenge I think we need to look at China's rise is both. I think there's positive ones. We have to affirm the achievements, but there are negative ones that we have to think about how to work with China, and how we're in a global division of labor, in a globalized economy, how do we share responsibilities as well as those wealth in the future. I think those issues the Chinese are debating themselves seriously on green GDP, on environmental friendly. I just was at the Shanghai Expo. The China Pavilion was very, very good, especially with a lot of education on consuming energy, on using energy-saving light bulbs. We're talking about close to 500,000 people going through the pavilion, mostly Chinese. I was really disappointed, by the way, to the US pavilion with a huge 3 theaters, 3 little, almost like little propaganda films. That's it. No exhibition, nothing. It was like, 你好, 再见, thank you, how are you? But the last one, of course, was very good on community building the inner cities. I thought that was impressive, but there was really no other things. It's very interesting if the theme is better city, better life. I think the Chinese are facing that challenge because we're looking at another 300 million people in the next 10 years to be urbanized in China. The largest internal migration in human history is going on in the past 20-some years, and it's going to go to accelerate, because now it's only less than 45% of Chinese population is urbanized, and with the large-scale urbanization in the coming 10 to 15 years, the Chinese is going to demand everything in terms of energy use, in terms of commodities, in terms of consumption, and then maybe we will have problems with property issues, with banking, which is always vulnerable. And the Chinese themselves know about this, and sometimes they're debating what to do with the bubble in the major cities. Shanghai, Beijing, Harbin, many cities I traveled, their housing price is basically approaching Vancouver, Toronto, New York scale. Ordinary people cannot afford it. And we're looking at a development model, and I shouldn't forget to mention this, that is, China now, in 30 years of explosive growth, has turned from one of the most equal societies in the world. Now, China is one of the most unequal, okay? The Gini coefficient from about 0.2.1, now it is over 0.5. I mean, when you're over 0.4, it's already considered the red line. And China, we're talking about income gap between urban and the rural areas as much as 7 to 8 times more. And I have tracked some of the migrant workers, talked to them. Back in the 1990s, I went to Shanghai construction site, I talked to the workers. They were earning about $120, $150 Canadian. They're about earning the same amount today. There was really not much of an increase. And that's the bargain the Chinese leadership put there to attract foreign capital, to put on the cheap labor. And now the challenge is, if you can't depend on a collapsed external demand, if you want to turn from an export-led growth model into a domestic consumption model, you've got to give people consumption power. And most of the people do not earn enough money to have the purchasing power. So this is a dilemma. And remember, this is a country, this is the party, the one party and the state is built on delivering continuous GDP growth in order to legitimize itself. And so this is a country that is very much turning into a very primitive form of capitalism. So some people say communist China. I always have trouble with that term. For those who have been to China, you know it is a communist country with hardly any communists left. I was staying at the Shanghai Dongjiao State House, a 1,200-acre garden house building within 10 years. And I said, who are running this? They said it was the Communist Party Committee of Shanghai. So they're all into business. Let's make no mistake about this. Anyway, I have about a few minutes left. The third question I think lets me touch upon is, what is the Chinese position in the G20, given the context of the discussion here? The Chinese now are debating themselves and about their positions. G20 is too new, and the Chinese, some advocate a more assertive role in international affairs. They demand to be recognized, and at the same time, they feel they have vulnerabilities. And I think somehow they're taking a wait-and-see situation. They do not want to assert leadership, nor do they want to be left behind. So Chinese are observing and thinking among the G20 powers, who are the allies? Who are the enemies, potentially adversaries, or who are the friends? Who are the ones in the middle? The Chinese are thinking strategically. They always contemplate about these issues. But there are a number of things the Chinese would definitely want to put on the table on every G20. That is, one is certainly about the financial reform issues of the international financial system. They challenge the dominance of the US dollar, as a global currency. They wanted to have World Bank and IMF reform to increase the shares, voting rights of shares of developing countries, including China. And so therefore, the Chinese are seeking systemic changes rather than changes within the system. There's no doubt about that. I think they will make it very clear. Maybe they're not taking a very assertive position. They're not like President Obama would write a letter to every leader prior to G20, but they're working very, very actively with a lot of parties, and they wanted to position themselves. So the issue now, I think we need to ask about the G20 format and the Chinese position in it is, to what extent, as we see China gradually becoming as almost equally a global power as the United States, to what extent China is going to assert itself in terms of norms. We tend to think there is no universal forms. The norms or the morality of the international system has always been the reflection of the dominant power or the dominant group of powers. As China rises, together with India, with Russia, with Brazil, and South Africa, they would assert their norms. And the question now is, what kind of norms China will do? So that leads to my last point, that is, how do we engage China? And I have seen heated debate about the Chinese changes, reforms, because China has a democracy deficit. It's a one-party state, and there is just very clear about it, and they themselves know about it. But the question now is, can we as external powers, be it Canada or G20 or the United States, can we assert ourselves to make demands to let the Chinese change? My experience and observation is that you can't. Even as the United States, as powerful as it is, the impact on internal development of China is limited. We have to simply acknowledge that. And I have seen some of my colleagues working, China sinologists or China watchers, they just get very impatient. They feel they have, I've worked on China for my lifetime, a whole generation, since mid-70s. I want to see China turning into a democracy, but China still is not a democracy. Another 30 years, I will be dead. I can't see it. What I'm saying to these people is, you really have to manage your expectations. Well, as the Chinese have managed their own, they're very patient, okay? So I think the important thing is that we have to realize the Chinese themselves, through their own struggle and debate, will change within China. So the best strategy, I think, to engage China is to observe China's internal dynamics very closely, understand it well, and design and devise policies that can promote democratic forces and positive changes and forces within China, and let the Chinese change themselves. And I think that with a China that moving in a reform and more open and internationalized positions, I think we will have a better chance to avoid systemic war or conflicts, and to accommodate probably, as Chinese themselves call, a peaceful rise of China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As I come to the podium, I realize that the bar keeps getting risen higher and higher all the time. And this morning at breakfast, Armin, who rose the bar quite high last night, she gave me some excellent advice. She said, you don't have to worry about getting over the bar. You can do the limbo. And that's, in some ways, if Wenran, my colleague from the University of Alberta, he represents the Chinese view, I will try to represent the Latin American and Caribbean view. Having been born in Barbados in the Caribbean, I lived here for 34 years in Canada, but I think I still have a love for that place, and I want to try to represent as best as possible what I call the marginal view in the international community. And in case I run out of time, I think what I'll do is start with my conclusion. In August 28th, 2001, Paul Martin issued a challenge to a group of people at the Vision 2020 conference at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. I happened to be one of those people at that conference, and Paul wasn't able to be there because he was busy being Canada's finance minister, and he was also busy being the chair of the G20 for the next G7, G8 summit. But he did speak to us via teleconference, and I thought I would quote his words. He said, the search for solutions, and this is just part of his speech, but he said the search for solutions, and this was to global financial trouble, is not the preserve of governments alone. It is rather a responsibility shared with academics, the private sector, the NGOs, and citizens at large. So basically what he was saying is that we have a stake, all of us here at Couch, we have a stake in the outcome of whatever the new bargain is going to be, the new grand bargain, over the changes that will occur in the international financial arena. Now, in 2008, when the financial crisis began, it began as a national crisis in the United States, but it quickly went viral. It quickly had a contagion effect of spreading across the globe in a very short space of time. And this is what was frightening about that particular crisis. Some scholars have actually detailed better than I could the sequence of events that led to the global crisis. And I'll try my best to give you that sequence as quickly as I can, as succinctly as I can. It started, of course, with the imprudent lending to borrowers who could not meet the normal conditions or criteria for creditworthiness in the United States. And this resulted, of course, in the subprime mortgage crisis in that country. And then, as a consequence of the securitization of those credits, they were resold en masse to banks and other financial institutions and intermediaries around the world. And the credit default swaps that then led to additional dissemination of related credit risks. Now, as the US subprime mortgage market collapsed with the bursting of the real estate bubble that Paul talked about, the related assets became toxic and therefore virtually worthless. And this is where the crisis of the banks come in, because as it became known that a large number of banks and other financial intermediaries held large exposure of these toxic assets, then there was general mistrust across the globe among banks. And this caused almost the disappearance of the interbank money market. And of course, the United States started to try to attempt to restore confidence in the banks through extensive governmental support of the financial sector. Also happened in Europe as well, in the European Union, in the form of guarantees of interbank loans, in the form of purchases of some of the toxic assets, in the form of injection of fresh capital, and taking over of failing banks. But this did not stop the credit crunch from infecting the larger economy, which fell into deep recession, as you know. The governmental support packages that were dreamed up to the larger economy, as well as to the financial sector, led to a massive increase in public deficits, leading to increased potential inflationary pressures in the future. And the rapidly increasing indebtedness of some of the countries concerned also raised the problem about the ability of these countries to meet their financial obligations in the future. And of course, we all know that credit markets froze and stock markets went into free fall around the globe. Now, by the early months of 2009, few parts of the world remained unaffected by this crisis. Walden Bello, who was supposed to be at that conference, by the way, in Victoria, but couldn't make it, he doesn't beat around the bush when he talks about this crisis and what really caused it. He's argued that it has been a result It resulted from a crisis of overproduction set in motion by corporate practices and corporate greed in direct responses to policies that were set back in the 1970s under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan of liberalization and deregulation. Apart from calls for alternatives to liberalization and for a stronger regulation of the banks and the financial sector, many observers and many of us in the political science world have begun to challenge the promotion of the invisible hand of the market, which held sway throughout the 1990s. And if you're interested, take a look at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development report that was published back in 2000 that actually ignited that whole debate about the invisible hand again. It's called Visible Hand. Take a look at that report and you'll see some of the arguments that were put forward in response to this. But I would argue that it was really not the invisible hand necessarily that led to the severe financial crisis. Certainly, national and global macroeconomic policies contributed to the large imbalances in the global economic sector and to the failure of risk management, which played a role in the buildup of vulnerabilities that eventually led to the crisis. And the blame there's enough blame to go around. You can start with the vulnerabilities, as Brad Stetzer has said. Vulnerabilities could not have grown so large without the assist of both the US government, which did not believe that the housing bubble posed much of a risk, and showed no interest in reining in the financial sector, and also those governments, like China, who financed the US through the increase in their reserves. So the blame can go around quite a bit on this one. This financial crisis provides us with a perfect example of systemic risks, as the former Prime Minister said today, at the international level. By systemic risk, we're talking about the contamination of other markets and sectors and jurisdictions following defaults at a national level in a given domestic economy. But we have to bear in mind that this is not the first time that the world has faced this kind of systemic risk. Recall the world economic crisis of the 1930s. What emerged from that crisis was a modern banking system, a modern banking supervision, along with domestic banking legislation in most financial sectors of the globe. Recall the uncontrolled expansion of the euro markets in the 1970s, and also the failure of the German bank Herstatt in 1974. This prompted concerns about markets escaping proper national oversight. And this led to the establishment of the Basel Committee on the banking system. It also led to the creation of new international financial standards. This, along with the BCBS, the International Organization of Security Commissions, helped to create those new international financial standards. Bear in mind that those standards were in place when this crisis happened. So you have to ask the question, why did these standards not mitigate that crisis? Also recall in the late 1990s, the Asian financial crisis, which led to the conception of the international financial architecture. It prompted people like Paul Martin and his counterparts in the G7, G8 to create the G20, and also to create the Financial Stability Forum, which Paul mentioned earlier. It's now called the Financial Stability Board, I believe. And this was intended to coordinate the activities of various financial standards, financial standard setting bodies. And these initiatives emerged because government leaders and finance ministers wanted to avoid the regulatory gaps, which Paul talked about, that might generate a systemic risk at the international level. And of course, then came the great global financial crisis of 2008. And again, we need to ask ourselves, why did these governing regulatory mechanisms that were put in place over 35 years at the international level, why these international financial standards fail to avert, or at least fail to mitigate, the global financial crisis. I don't have all the answers to this, but I can certainly suggest that perhaps the standards were treated by global leaders less as sort of hard international law, or more like soft law, or normative guidelines. Clearly, some of the existing international financial standards were either overlooked, disregarded, or simply ignored at the national as well as at the global level. Now, the global financial crisis therefore reveals some serious shortcomings, both in the financial industry and by regulatory and supervisory authorities at the national and global levels. And this has led for calls for reform of the international financial architecture. And this is what that conference back in 2001 was all about. Let's think about what the international financial architecture would look like by the year 2020. It also called for enhancing and supplementing the existing international financial standards so as to eliminate those dangerous gaps in supervision and regulation of international financial markets. In other words, what we were challenged to do after the crisis was to try to make the international financial system more crisis resistant instead of reacting to crises, as Paul Martin put it, to create proactive measures so that we will be crisis resistant. But what has been most remarkable, I think, about the policy response to the crisis is the extent to which the response has been nationally based as opposed to internationally arranged. And this is one of the major points I'm going to come to as I wrap up, because I think this is a very important issue. It is a global problem, but being addressed in many respects by national governments. Yes, there were calls at the time for global coordination, but for the most part, immediate policy responses were undertaken on an ad hoc basis at the national level by national authorities. One has to wonder whether or not this financial crisis is not more than about the problems of the financial sector, whether it maybe was about something much deeper. Was it a crisis in politics, a crisis in representation, a crisis in legitimacy, a crisis in democracy? Was it a crisis in global governance itself? I think it was a crisis in global governance itself. And I think this is why this crisis has to be addressed, not just by the G7, G8, as Mr. Martin and others have pointed out, but by a more representative, more legitimate, more democratic global body. Now the question is the G20 that body? And to my mind, I think you can make a lot of arguments why the G20 might be a better representative body than the G7, G8. Certainly, the G20 member governments represent some 90% of the global GNP, and they represent 80% of world trade, and within their borders are contained 2/3 of the world's population. So in some sense, yes, there's some legitimacy attached to the representative nature of the G20. If you go to the G20's website, you'll see this statement: the G20's economic weight and broad membership gives it a high degree of legitimacy and influence over the management of the global economy and the financial system. But I have to say, the G20 is not really the G20. It's more like the G43, right? When you think about it, you have Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the EU. Now, the EU in itself, if you take the EU, you're looking at a whole bunch of other states involved there. And when you add, in effect, take in consideration all the countries in the EU, the G20 then becomes actually the G42. The reality is that the G20 has a flexibility of expansion, I think, of its membership as well. I go back to the early meetings of the G20. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund, the president of the World Bank, they sit as ex officio, right? In the April 2009 meeting, present at the meetings were the United Nations Secretary General, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, the chairman of the Financial Stability Forum, now the Financial Stability Board. Spain and the Netherlands were invited as observers at the Pittsburgh meeting. The EU has added its first permanent president of the European Council, as well as its first High Commissioner or High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. So it seems to be a fairly flexible coalition of countries. But the reality is that the G20 is still not sufficiently representative, in my opinion, right? 5 more minutes. It excludes 150 other states when you look at the United Nations membership of 192 states. Those 150 states represents 2.42 billion people, 35.6% of the world's population. These 150 states generate US $12.7 trillion of the world's global GDP, and that's 18%. These 150 states represent several regions of the world, including North, West, and East Africa, the Caribbean, Central and Eastern Europe. They also include relatively rich countries like New Zealand and Singapore. And the 150 states that are excluded from the G20 include populous countries like Iran, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Ukraine. Do these countries not have the right to have a say in the development of a new international bargain on international financial architecture, and to help to mitigate the risks that they will have to suffer from as a result of failures in the other countries? Could it be that the best place for these kinds of grand bargains ought to be the G192? As the former president of the United Nations General Assembly, Miguel Descoto Brockman, he used to call the General Assembly the G192. Joe Stiglitz, who was present at that meeting in Victoria, he noted that the alternative recommendations for dealing with the financial crisis, this current financial crisis, most of them coming from the United Nations Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its Impact on Development report, which was really a report by the G192, was stronger and more forceful than the April 2009 G20 communique. Now, this suggests, in fact, I think he suggests that it demonstrates that it's very important to have an inclusive process, especially when you're dealing with the grand bargain. It's almost like creating a new Bretton Woods in some ways, but in 2010. The G192 were willing to take key issues, to raise key issues that the internal politics of the G20 found it difficult and too sensitive to deal with. And those are some of the issues that Paul Martin raised as well. You know, what do we do about climate change? What do we do about HIV/AIDS? What do we do about food security? What do we do about human trafficking? And all these other issues that need to be covered in the creation of this new bargain. These alternative voices ought to be heard because they come from a significant marginal majority. There is something to be said for expanding, of course, from the G7, G8 to the G20 in terms of the broader mix of cultures and values that are represented. But the main justification for the G20 membership has been economic weight. It's even listed on their website. And this is a reference to power, material capability. In the reconfiguration of any world order, you're going to have a mix of not just material capability and power, but also ideas and institutions, right? Robert Cox talks about the configuration of the world order and the changes that occur in world order. You can identify those changes when you see changes in the ideas. You talked a little bit about this, Wenran, when you talk about values and norms of the emerging powers. Also, the changes that occur within the institutional setting, as well as the material changes, the emergence of new powers like the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, or ISBA, the India, Brazil, IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa. We have the G77 in the UN General Assembly. There are a whole bunch of coalitions already within the United Nations system. Many of these countries of the G150 are still concerned about the continuing dominance of the too narrow neoliberal models in finance that got us into this mess. And they're not at all sanguine about the ability of the G20 to get us out of it, or to create a new and more robust international financial standards that would be treated merely as not simply as normative recommendations and guidelines. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Shenai, and I'm here to speak from the American perspective on this issue. So first of all, I'd like to thank SEPA for inviting me here and having me here speak before this august audience. And I'd also like to thank, in particular, David McCone for recruiting me to speak before you today. Now, I am here to give an American perspective on recent shifts in global power, and there is one, okay? And particularly in the wake of the most recent global financial crisis in America, it's caused a deep amount of introspection. So I'm here to report back on some of the things we've realized. Now, my point, in short, whether you like it or not, is that America's here to stay. Okay? Now, I don't mean that in any glib sense of it, but our share of hard economic and military power, it definitely might fall relatively with respect to rising great powers like India and China. Empirically, it's true, okay? But that being said, we're still going to continue to be a first-rate international power and more importantly, a provider of global stability for the foreseeable future, okay? So the constellation that is amassed into the current international system is here to stay. So I'm going to explain why in a second. But first, I just want to make an observation, okay? Now, social scientists like us, we're just as likely to fall for trendy ideas as probably anybody else in any other field. Now, these trendy ideas are often adopted as orthodoxy until the next trend-setting idea comes and replaces it and unseats the incumbent, often in spectacular fashion. I'll draw on an example from the American situation, let's say in 2000, 2001. Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, had declared something known as the Great Moderation, which is, of course, the triumph over inflation and unemployment. We had thought we had conquered the business cycle, and most of our economic technocrats believed that. And that, of course, was exposed in brutal form in the credit crunch of 2008 and the macro fallout today. So over the past 20 years, the global consensus of America's international position has swung like a pendulum between two different extremes. Some scholars, such as Johns Hopkins' own Dr. Francis Fukuyama, were quick to identify the end of the Soviet Union as a sort of end of history, or a triumph of the Western-style liberal democracy over all other forms of human organization. Now, others claim that this was the beginning of a unipolar moment, of unmitigated hegemony of the United States and dominance over the international system. Now, that's one view. Well, today, pessimism is again in vogue. The last decade certainly hasn't been kind to America. Through many missteps, some of which were admittedly our own doing, America's relative power has eroded through its global war on terror, costly invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the emergence of rising great powers such as the People's Republic of China and, of course, India. And, of course, the United States still struggles with the lingering macroeconomic effects of the global financial crisis, including hundreds of billions of dollars in lost potential output, and we're currently battling near double-digit unemployment, as you all know. So, in part, these extreme shifts in opinion do reflect a natural dynamic, a natural give and take of the actual power dynamic of the international system. Now, some would argue that the global power arrangement was indeed unipolar, and others will claim that today it's far more multipolar. Well, I contend that in reality, both of these extreme notions of American hegemony and extreme American decline are simply oversimplifications of a far more nuanced international system. Now, I would encourage everyone in this room to reject any monolithic approach to the international system, and I would encourage anybody to be skeptical of this notion, okay? So, because of that, I believe that fundamentally, the United States really is here to stay for three principal reasons, and let's jump into those. Now, there's a big if. The big question is, can China, Brazil, India, emerging powers like Indonesia, Venezuela, etc., can they continue their power growth that we've seen over the past 10 years? And social scientists are quick to come and say, well, if we project over the next 10 years, then yes, they will overtake the United States in this metric. And if we project their naval growth over the next 20 years, then this will be the likely outcome. Well, I think if the global financial crisis has taught us anything, it's that these linear projections should be treated with a high degree of skepticism. And so it's my goal right now is to make the skeptic's case against the rise of India and China. So my first reason, America's here to stay. Premature calls for American decline usually rest on the assumption of unmitigated growth in countries like India and China. And while India and China's growth has indeed been spectacular, both countries' future prospects have really been yet to be tested in a world where the United States isn't the primary driver of the global political economy. I think that's a very important point. So China's export-led model has worked very well up until this point. I'm not going to dispute that. But there's still ample contrarian evidence that their economy lacks the mechanisms necessary to spur domestic consumption and rebalance their economy. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, as manufacturing output slows due to stagnating global demand that I foresee to continue for some time, Chinese asset prices will continue to fall. And we referred earlier to a global asset price bubble, and particularly a property boom in China that is bursting. Now, because of this, Chinese consumers are still saving aggressively at a time when they should be spending more in order to rebalance the global economy, i.e. import more from the developed world and export less. Now, can we really blame the Chinese consumer for saving aggressively after only 50 years ago having gone through the Great Leap Forward? In my opinion, no. Okay, so what we really have to face is a reality where unit labor costs in China are going to continue to rise, right? China's economic future will become unclear. Now, why is that? Well, the great question hanging over a country like China is, can their economy rise up the value chain and become an innovative-based economy despite a weak property rights provisions and a heretofore dormant entrepreneurial spirit? And my belief is it can, but it'll take a while. As for India, its democracy is one of its greatest strengths and greatest liabilities. Can their government achieve the fruits of authoritarian-led growth without the authoritarianism? Again, a huge question that has to be answered. Now, politically, both countries face far more problems at home than my Western counterparts ever realize. China's economy is bifurcated into a prosperous coast and impoverished Western interior. Now, as a result, China's internal migrant labor force is approximately 150 million people strong annually. Think about that. 5 times the population of Canada traveling to find work within China on an annual basis. Now, this has created a system of internal remittances that thus far has quelled domestic dissatisfaction with, dare I say, an authoritarian and at times a repressive central government. Now, this system has worked because incomes have risen, but my question before you today is this system hasn't been tested in a world where China's growth engine has slowed down. So that is a lingering concern facing China in their interior. Furthermore, territorial disputes also threaten their political stability, as recent history with the Uyghurs and Tibetans has showed us. Now, of course, India faces its own set of problems, especially in security competition with its neighbor Pakistan. India practiced extreme prudence and, dare I say, restraint in the wake of the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks. But the real question before us is that was, by the scale of how bad it could have been, pretty mild. Will India continue to practice such restraint if we have the Mumbai terror attacks to the nth degree? And that's, again, a big question and one that the global system has to be prepared to answer. So because again, these are factors to doubt the ascension of these rising great powers, and it'll happen. But again, there are many roadblocks, and I urge you not to just take it for granted. Now, of course, this leads me to my second broad reason why America is here to stay, and this has to do with forces closer to home, or dare I say, a little bit south of the border. So, the U.S. economy still remains the most dynamic and innovative economy in the world, bar none. Period. End of story. Now, sure, America has gone through recent setbacks. I'm not going to deny that. And the global financial crisis was indeed a rude awakening that America's debt-fueled consumption couldn't continue ad infinitum. But there are indeed two sides of every economic crisis. In the wake of falling asset values, a falling equity market, high unemployment, there's actually an economic opportunity therein, a sort of Schumpeterian creative destruction, wherein entrepreneurs sift through the mess and actually create. I would submit to you that America remains the world's leading economy to exploit periods of economic weakness to further drive the innovation process. Now, of course, there's several roadblocks to this, and to answer a call of one of the prior speakers, I want to come up with a couple key ways in which we can ensure that America maintains this advantage. Well, the first key reform to this has to do with the gross misallocation of human capital in America. Now, I don't know if you know this, but for the class of 2008, graduating from Harvard College, approximately 30% of them took a job on Wall Street. 30%, approximately 1 in 3. If you include management consulting, that number rises to 50%. Well, what drove a lot of the profits in management consulting? Well, due diligence for leveraged buyouts, finance, right? So about 50% of America's best and brightest in a given year took a job in an industry that, up until this point, hasn't really shown its ability to create long-lasting value to average incomes in America. So that remains a big challenge in how we create the incentives from a compensation standpoint, et cetera, is going to be a key driver in determining how well America maintains this innovation advantage that I spoke about earlier. Secondly, I think a key reform that we need to make at home has to do with the approach the Federal Reserve takes to asset price bubbles. And I know what you're thinking, this is an economist technocratic note, but it's an important one because had the Fed targeted the residential mortgage boom, let's say in 2002 and 2003, the scale of the crisis simply would have been less. And that's an important point, again, that constantly gets overlooked. But the final key thing that America needs to make internally to maintain its advantage, the single most important thing, in my opinion, has to do with our culture. And this is where I think we can, dare I say, take a page out of Canada's playbook. Because America has a debt culture. And what do I mean by that? Well, in America today, if you want to take out a mortgage to purchase a home, your payment on your mortgage interest, on the interest you pay on your mortgage, is tax deductible. In other words, you're paid to borrow money. Think about that. I mean, the reason why this is the case, the myriad has to do with social engineering, trying to get people into homes. But regardless, it's there. So we have to deal with it. We have to change our debt culture. That also exists at the corporate level. Corporations are allowed to deduct their interest payments on debt. People would claim that this is a major cause for the LBO boom that also preceded the crisis. So again, changing the debt culture will take time, and that's where I hope we continue to have cross-cultural exchanges like the one we're having today. So finally, and perhaps most importantly, the third reason why I think America's here to stay and why the global order will be continued to be dominated by the American narrative. And that's the idea that the American-led world order is simply the most moral one. And I'm going to differ with my colleague here, because I do believe there's a degree of universal morality. Constructive debate is allowed, right? So yeah, I do believe that the American world order is the most just one, the most just hegemony, if we want to call it that, the world has ever seen. So for a second, I want you to juxtapose in your mind America and their series of allies in Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Western Europe on one end, all thriving liberal democracies, all with the strong sense of civil society, all with, dare I say, the most just form of government man has created up until this point. And then juxtapose that against China's unholy alliances with military dictatorships across Asia. You have propping up toxic regimes like Burma and North Korea. These aren't exactly the best company to keep. Now, I think that this represents two very distinct visions of global order, and I'm willing to hang my hat on the American one because I think it's the most sustainable one. Now, I agree, we Americans can get pretty carried away with this notion sometimes, but by and large, America is still a force for good in the world. It's created the space for 50 years of peace and prosperity for our allies. I mean, think about that. It has fueled a liberal global trading system with open markets, etc., that has allowed hundreds of millions of Chinese to be lifted out of poverty. And above all else, its strength lies not in the bean counting of guns, of tanks, of nuclear weapons and carrier groups, but in the liberal world order of which America is the guarantor. Now, American allies can't count on American security umbrella forever. I'm not going to say that they can. But this is why America must promote burden sharing with its allies, like the US is doing with regards to the Korean Peninsula, where we're devolving day-to-day military operations in South Korea to the South Korean Republic of Korea's army. Now, that said, there's always going to be detractors of American leadership. Consider America's trying history. It's just been a series of unfortunate adversities that we've overcome. The War of Independence to a brutal civil war, a 20th century that saw the Great Depression, fascism, and later communism. America always rose to meet these challenges. Now, some people might say, some IR scholars might say, well, look, this just happens to do with their rising share of relative power. It has to do with blind luck. They're isolated, etc. That's one interpretation, but I don't find it particularly compelling, because luck can happen anywhere. I think it has to do more with the fact of America's unique blend of accountable political institutions and a healthy skepticism of the status quo, and of course the strength in its citizens and the liberal world order that they choose to promote. Now, relative decline and power shifts are vague terms, and that's what I'm here to speak to you about today. So if we can quantify them as a three-pronged function of hard military power, economic dynamism, and the visceral appeal of its wielders' institutions, then America will continue to be a first-rate global power. Now, its hard power will remain challenged, while its economic advantages will oftentimes seem eroded by the rise of challengers coming and going. But it remains to be seen by this audience up until this point, and a point I want to make clear. It's that all the challengers, particularly the most recent ones, have an uncanny ability to challenge America on America's own terms. Now, what do I mean by this? Look at the rise of China. They've largely done so through an American-led world order, American institutions, and largely on America's terms. Now, think about it. Provisions for property rights or flexible markets with floating prices. These are things that were anathema to the Chinese 50 years ago that they've wholesale adopted today. How about the affinity the United States has to the government of India, a full-fledged democracy in a country that oftentimes doesn't seem like it has the capability? And this is the concluding point I want to make, because America's power, it has a lot to do with its hard military power, but I would say that the ideas that govern the international system aren't purely derivative of that power. They're not. They're more derivative of the internal appeal, the endogenous appeal of the ideas themselves. And that's the point I want to conclude on, and that's why America, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, is here to stay. Thank you very much.